In December of 1623, one of the most respected physicians in Europe sat down to write a private clinical account of his patient, a man who drank sweet wine steadily from waking until bed and who had ignored every warning about it. Sir Theodore de Mayerne recorded the habit precisely, along with the refusal to change it. The patient wore 2 crowns. Mayerne treated James VI of Scotland and the First of England, and by the time those observations reached paper, the king's body had begun failing in ways his physician could name with confidence and cure not at all. What does a doctor do when the patient cannot be ordered to stop? And how should a historian 4 centuries later decide whether a man who drank from morning until night, yet who reportedly never appeared intoxicated, belongs in a survey of royal dependency at all? Across the 400 years that followed that report, 8 more members of the British royal family left behind evidence of heavy drinking or drug reliance sturdy enough to survive modern scrutiny. Some lay dying while their physicians fed them opiates. Others, young and healthy and bored past endurance, possessed money, access, and nothing in particular to occupy them. Join me to find out. The word attached to this subject in popular culture lands hard, and one hesitates to use a term like junkie about people who died long before the clinical vocabulary of addiction existed. Addiction, as a diagnosis, a disorder with recognized criteria and stages, belongs to the 20th century. Applying it backwards to a Victorian widow taking laudanum for rheumatism or to a Georgian gentleman working through 3 bottles of port at dinner tells us more about our own assumptions than about theirs. Legal categories shift just as violently. Laudanum, an alcoholic tincture of opium, sold over a counter in 19th century Britain without a prescription or a question, while cocaine turned up in tonics and wines advertised in respectable newspapers and endorsed by respectable people. Cannabis, criminalized across the 20th century, came recommended by leading physicians as a medicine. Meanwhile, the one substance that killed or crippled the largest number of royals in this account has stayed legal throughout, taxed and poured at every state dinner: alcohol. Then comes the question of what counted as excess in the first place. Georgian aristocratic society treated enormous alcohol consumption as a marker of status rather than of failing, and a man who could not hold his drink at table earned pity for weakness rather than for illness. Jacobean England distrusted water for good reason, so ale or wine filled the cup at every table from laborer to king. Against that background, what matters is not whether a royal figure drank heavily, but whether the drinking startled even their own contemporaries, who set the bar remarkably high. So this account restricts itself to 9 people, each of whom left a documentary trail: physicians' clinical notes, court records, private letters from family members, diaries kept by courtiers with no reason to flatter, or, in one modern case, a published admission written by the subject himself. Rumor stays out. The 3 most famous stories that failed the test appear near the end, since a false royal reputation often reveals as much about the institution as a true one does. We begin with the king whose doctor wrote everything down. James Stuart came to the English throne in 1603, already an experienced monarch, having ruled Scotland since infancy under conditions that would have broken most men. By the last years of his reign, his court carried a reputation for indulgence that his own subjects commented on freely, while his physician quietly kept clinical records of a body in decline. Mayenne's report of December 1623 remains among the most detailed medical documents to survive about any early modern ruler, describing a patient who drank much sweet wine continuously and who ignored every attempt at moderation. Which wines he chose forms part of the story. James favored Frontignac and other strong sweet varieties shipped up from southern Europe, taking them unmixed at a period when diluting wine with water counted as ordinary practice among people who could afford either. Ale and wine formed part of the daily diet across Jacobean England because water carried disease and everybody knew it. The distinction lay in strength and volume, and Mayerne, who treated the wealthiest patients on the continent, recognized the difference immediately. Mayerne connected the drinking directly to what he found in his patient. Gout attacked the king severely enough to leave him unable to walk or ride, and arthritis, nephritis, and a chronic diarrhea drained him for long stretches at a time, all of which his physician attributed at least partly to the sweet wine. Government slowed with him. During his final years, James governed intermittently at best, and the daily management of affairs slid towards his favorites and his son, with results that would shape the next 2 decades of English history. Whether James qualifies as an alcoholic divides historians precisely here. Pauline Croft draws attention to a distinction Mayerne himself insisted upon. Heavy and constant though the drinking ran, the physician recorded that the king never drank to intoxication. A man never drunk and never entirely sober occupies a category our language handles badly, which is why his biographers still argue over the label 300 years after his death. Beyond dispute lies the physical toll, catalogued in a doctor's own hand while the patient still lived and still refused to listen. A little over a century later, another Stuart drank himself into ruin, though this one lacked a kingdom to neglect. Charles Edward Stuart, born in 1720, remains familiar as the young man who landed in Scotland in 1745 with almost nothing and came within a few weeks' march of London. What followed Culloden attracts far less attention. He lived another 42 years, most of them in exile in Rome and Florence, without occupation, without a throne, and with a title that fewer and fewer European courts would recognize. Evidence for his drinking comes from the people closest to him, which complicates any attempt to dismiss it as enemy propaganda. His brother, Henry Benedict Stuart, wrote about it, and his wife, Princess Louise of Stolberg-Gedern, described a husband perpetually drunk. A bottle of Cyprus wine sat beneath his bed so that he could reach it without rising, and heavy quantities of brandy went down every day besides. European aristocrats of the period drank a great deal as a matter of course, yet Charles managed to shock them, turning up intoxicated in public and at occasions where even a generous contemporary standard expected restraint. His body registered the cost in the usual way, with dropsy and asthma among the complaints that dogged his last years. The damage he did to others followed less predictable lines. He beat his wife, who eventually fled him, and the scandal ran through the Italian courts that housed him out of charity and dynastic sentiment. French and papal support, already thinning, evaporated. Whatever political future the Jacobite cause retained after 1745 died in those rooms in Rome, rather than on the field at Culloden. Frank McLynn reads the drinking as self-medication by a man carrying trauma he possessed no framework for understanding, and the timing supports the reading since the collapse begins after the rising fails. Other historians point to inherited disease as a contributor to his physical deterioration. Both readings can hold together, with causes running in both directions at once. The most charismatic pretender in Europe ended as a bloated invalid whom his own relatives struggled to sit in a room with. George IV presents the most thoroughly documented case in this account, largely because he lived surrounded by people who wrote things down and by artists who drew what they saw. Born in 1762, he spent his adult life as the most caricatured man in Britain, and the caricaturists invented very little. Charles Greville kept a diary, Sir Henry Halford kept the medical records, and between the two of them survives a picture of consumption that startles even now. By the 1820s, the king worked through copious amounts of cherry brandy alongside the port and Madeira that furnished every Georgian dinner table. He also took up to 100 drops of laudanum in a single day. That combination, an opium tincture layered over sustained heavy drinking, would empty a modern ward of everything except alarm. His physicians saw only a patient in constant pain, and the pain existed. Gout and dropsy had settled into him as the accumulated interest on a lifetime of gluttony. Georgian elite society had celebrated exactly this appetite for decades, which complicates any judgment passed on him now, since prodigious drinking marked a man as convivial rather than diseased. But the king's body kept its own accounts. By the end, extreme obesity, hardened arteries, and gout that immobilized him for weeks defined the shape of his existence. While politically he approached uselessness, disengaged from business and increasingly unwilling to appear before anyone at all. Cartoonists drew him as a whale, as a swollen ruin in silk, and the public bought the prints in enormous numbers. The prestige of the monarchy took damage that his brother and his niece would spend decades repairing. Christopher Hibbert reads The Laudanum and the Brandy as the final chapter of one long story about a man who never once declined anything he wanted. Others argue that the enormous doses of his last years belong to a different category altogether, amounting to straightforward compassion towards a dying man whose pain admitted no other remedy. That same argument returns in every 19th century case that follows, as we shall soon see, and it never quite resolves itself. Before the Victorians, the pharmacy of their period needs explaining because without it their behavior looks stranger than it should. Opium and its derivatives sold legally and cheaply to anybody who walked into a shop with a few coins, and nobody treated the purchase as a vice. Working families dosed teething infants with opiate syrups, respectable households kept laudanum beside the vinegar, and Virginia Barrage and Griffith Edwards, in their study of opiate use in 19th century England, established how thoroughly ordinary all of this appeared before the pharmacy legislation and the moral panics of the later century. Then came the hypodermic needle, introduced in the 1850s, which delivered morphine directly and fast and transformed the management of severe pain almost overnight. It created a problem nobody anticipated. Patients under long-term treatment for chronic conditions developed physical dependency produced entirely by their own doctors, a phenomenon now called iatrogenic addiction, and the medical profession spent the rest of the century discovering what it had built. 2 members of Queen Victoria's household fall into that category, and one of them wore the crown. The private medical diaries of Sir James Reed, personal physician to Victoria across the last 20 years of her reign, record laudanum prescribed to her regularly for pain. Rheumatism troubled her badly in old age alongside the ordinary accumulated aches of a woman who lived into her 80s, and nothing about the prescription stayed hidden or shameful. A physician handing opium tincture to an elderly patient in 1890 practiced entirely unremarkable medicine. Reed noted it down in the same flat tone he used for her appetite and her sleep. Victoria's association with cocaine arrived through a different door. Vin Mariani, a French tonic wine infused with coca leaf, dominated the patent medicine market of the period through an advertising campaign that collected celebrity endorsements the way later brands would collect athletes, and the Queen permitted her likeness to appear in it. Popes and presidents did the same across Europe and America. The product sold legally and fashionably on precisely the grounds that would later see it outlawed. Her third association changed British obstetrics. Victoria championed chloroform during childbirth at a time when clergy and physicians alike insisted that women should suffer in labor, and her example normalized anesthesia across the country more effectively than any medical paper could have managed. Across all 3 substances, the pattern holds steady: palliative use, prescribed or endorsed within the conventions of her era, with no documented impairment of her mental faculties or her sovereign duties. Medical historians warn explicitly against the retrospective label. Barrage states the objection directly, arguing that calling Victoria an addict imports a modern clinical category into a period where her behavior represented standard therapeutic practice for anyone who could afford a doctor. She belongs in this account not because she lost control, but because the substances she took would place a modern patient under supervision and a modern celebrity on a front page. Her 8th child presents the harder case. Prince Leopold, born in 1853, inherited the hemophilia that his mother transmitted through her daughters into half the royal houses of Europe, and he suffered from it in an age that could neither treat nor properly explain the condition. Joint hemorrhages left him in agony for days at a time, immobilized and sleepless and at risk of dying from shock alone. Victoria's own journals track these episodes with a mother's precision, while the medical notes of Sir William Jenner supply the clinical detail. What Jenner and his colleagues gave the boy came in the form of morphine, frequently and heavily, often through the newly invented hypodermic needle. The drug worked. It carried him through bleeding episodes that might otherwise have killed him outright, turning a life of recurrent hemorrhage into something survivable rather than simply unbearable. Administered on that scale across years to a patient whose condition never resolved, morphine also produced exactly the dependency that the new technology quietly created across Europe. Leopold grew frail and lethargic in ways his family attributed to the hemophilia and which may have belonged at least partly to the treatment. He achieved more than anyone expected of him regardless, taking a degree at Oxford, working as an unofficial secretary to his mother, marrying and fathering a daughter along the way. In March of 1884 at Caen, he fell and struck his knee. The cerebral hemorrhage that followed killed him at 30, some months before the birth of his son. Charlotte Ziepvat, his biographer, frames the difficulty plainly. Separating Leopold's undeniable physical dependency on opiates from the palliative care that kept him breathing cannot really be done because they amounted to the same syringe. His doctors indulged nothing whatsoever. They reached for the only remedy available to them, and the dependency arrived as part of the price. The 1920s changed the picture again, and quickly. Cocaine spread through fashionable London society in the years after the First World War, reaching nightclubs and private houses among a generation that had watched its brothers die in France and lost patience with the moral certainties of their parents. The Dangerous Drugs Act of 1920 criminalized the trade just as the fashion peaked, which meant that for the first time a royal user broke the law rather than merely indulging a taste. Morphine remained obtainable through the right private medical connections, and the aristocracy possessed them all. Cocktail culture arrived on the same tide, glamorous and American, and endorsed enthusiastically by the Prince of Wales himself. Beneath the glamour sat a post-war disillusionment that the period's own writers described repeatedly, and which the drinking and the drug-taking of the era answered in the only way immediately to hand. Two brothers, sons of George V, entered that world. Both came out of it damaged. Prince George, fourth surviving son of George V, struck contemporaries as the most charming and the least steady of the brothers. Born in 1902, he moved through the fastest circles London could supply during the 1920s, and according to royal biographer Christopher Warwick, he used cocaine and morphine heavily across those years. Among his associations was Kiki Preston, an American socialite whose reputation in that world required no explanation from anybody. The response came from inside the family rather than from any doctor. Warwick documents that Edward, then Prince of Wales, intervened directly with his younger brother, removing him from circulation and confining him at York House for a severe period of detoxification intended to break the habit outright. No clinic and no program in the modern sense existed anywhere in Britain. An older brother, a locked house, and a great deal of suffering produced the result which by the surviving accounts held. Blackmail worried the palace far more than the drugs themselves did. A royal duke buying illegal cocaine from suppliers who recognized his face amounted to an open invitation, and the family faced threats on exactly that basis during the late 1920s. George recovered sufficiently to resume public duties, married Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark, and rebuilt a public reputation that still required steady management behind the scenes. He died in a plane crash in 1942. Historians disagree about how long the dependency lasted. Warwick presents a contained episode of youth, ended by his brother's intervention and never repeated afterwards, while others suspect that the psychological vulnerabilities behind it persisted well into the 1930s, whatever the state of his actual consumption by then. The archive thins out at exactly the point where it would prove most useful, a pattern this series encounters often. The brother who staged that intervention carried a problem of his own, less dramatic in kind and far heavier in consequence. Edward, Prince of Wales, and briefly King Edward VIII drank heavily for most of his adult life, and the people who worked for him wrote it down. Letters from his advisor Sir Walter Monckton refer to it, and courtiers' diaries, Tommy Lascelles among them, record it with the exasperation of men who worked around it daily. Philip Ziegler, his official biographer, traces a reliance on cocktails and whiskey running through the years as Prince of Wales and deepening considerably in the long exile that followed the abdication. The sources point fairly clearly at what the drink did for him. Edward found social occasions harder than his effortless public manner suggested, and boredom of a peculiarly royal kind troubled him besides the boredom of a man with a crowded diary and nothing whatever to decide. Exile worsened both. Stripped of function after 1936, married and settled into a life of visits and villas and the perpetual small warfare of precedents, he faced decades to fill and cocktails to fill them with. The consequences reached past his own health. His drinking fed the erratic behavior and irresponsibility that alarmed his father, and George V's despairing remarks about his heir came from no position of ignorance, since government ministers had reached similar conclusions independently. By the time the crisis of 1936 arrived, much of the British establishment already doubted this man could perform the job at all. Emotional dependence on Wallace Simpson, which the same sources describe as near total, grew in the same soil. Francis Donaldson treats the drinking as a character weakness that rendered him incapable of sovereign duty, full stop. Ziegler accepts the heavy consumption but declines the clinical label, reading it instead as one symptom among many of an emotional development that stalled somewhere in his 20s and never resumed. Either way, the abdication removed from the throne a man whose private habits had worried his advisors for 15 years before the country ever heard the name Simpson. His niece supplies the case modern audiences know best, and the one where the daily routine survives in the most exact detail. Princess Margaret, born in 1930, drank on a schedule. Craig Brown records a day beginning with a vodka pick-me-up at 12:30, moving to wine at lunch, and continuing into heavy whiskey through the evening and well into the night. Courtier memoirs and credible biographers describe the same pattern from multiple angles across decades, which explains why it survives the usual skepticism applied to royal gossip. Nothing about this attracted much comment within the circles she moved in. Mid-20th century aristocratic culture normalized daily drinking and constant smoking to a degree difficult to convey now, and little stigma attached to either inside elite private circles until late in the century. She smoked as heavily as she drank. The combination did the damage. Margaret suffered multiple strokes and underwent surgery to remove a portion of her lung, and her final years passed largely in a wheelchair, with public appearances growing rare and dark glasses covering her face when she managed them at all. She died in 2002. The press by then treated her as a tragic hedonist, the princess who received all the glamour of the position and none of the purpose, and the obituaries returned to the drinking within a paragraph or two. Christopher Warwick, who wrote her biography, pushes back firmly on the popular diagnosis, arguing that Margaret drank heavily and habitually without ever meeting the clinical definition of an alcoholic, since she suffered no withdrawal and never lost basic function. Popular media diagnoses her regardless, decades after her death and with no medical record to consult. Her lungs took no interest in the distinction. The final case concerns a living person, which imposes a strict limit on what can responsibly appear here. Everything below comes from the subject's own published account of himself, with nothing drawn from press speculation or unnamed sources. In Spare, published in 2023, Prince Harry set out his substance use in detail, and with very little hedging, recording his first use of cocaine at 17 during a hunting weekend. Cannabis followed frequently at Eton and again in the period after his military service. He also described psilocybin and ayahuasca in his 30s, framing the psychedelics as therapeutic rather than recreational, which places them in an odd position relative to everything else in this account. Legally, those substances separate sharply. Cocaine and cannabis remain illegal in the United Kingdom under the Misuse of Drugs Act of 1971. Whatever the prevalence of their recreational use across the country, while psychedelics occupy stranger ground, having become the subject of a renaissance in clinical psychiatric research into trauma. That research matches the motivations the Duke himself described. A man writing about ayahuasca and grief in 2023 wrote into an active scientific argument rather than a purely criminal one. The reaction split along predictable lines. Conservative commentators treated the admissions as a breach of institutional decorum, while mental health advocates welcomed the candor, particularly around the self-medication of complex grief. Royal biographers and media analysts continue to argue over whether publishing any of it assisted the author's recovery or damaged an institution with no means of reply. Nobody disputes the source since the subject wrote it himself and put his name on the cover. 3 familiar stories reached the shortlist and then failed it, and each shows how royal reputations grow out of very little. The first concerns Queen Victoria and cannabis, a claim that circulates endlessly online and appears in print more often than it should, holding that her physician prescribed Indian hemp for menstrual cramps. Her doctor, J.R. Reynolds, certainly advocated medical cannabis in general terms and argued the case in public. But no verifiable evidence exists in the royal archives, nor in the private clinical diaries of Sir James Reed, that anything of the kind ever reached the Queen herself. An advocate's published opinion has been quietly converted into a patient's prescription. Queen Anne supplies the second, her nickname Brandy Nan, having followed her for 3 centuries. Modern historiography recognizes it as a political smear circulated by her detractors rather than a description of her habits, and her physical decline drew on causes enough without any brandy at all: severe gout, lupus, and the trauma of 17 failed pregnancies. Her opponents slandered her efficiently. The nickname outlived every one of them. The third concerns Prince Albert Victor, who died in 1892 and who has since attracted retrospective association with the Cleveland Street scandal and with various drug dens, none of it supported by a credible primary source. No document establishes that he used drugs at all. The rumors fastened on him because he died young and left a vacancy that speculation rushed to fill within a decade of the funeral. Set side by side, the 9 cases fall into 2 groups that barely resemble each other. The first runs iatrogenic, dependency created by doctors doing their jobs, mostly across the 19th century, when opiates supplied the only effective answer to chronic pain and incurable disease. Victoria and her son Leopold belong here, along with a portion of George IV's laudanum use in his final years. Calling these people addicts blames patients for their treatment. The second group looks entirely different. Charles Edward Stuart in exile, Edward VIII in exile, George of Kent in the nightclubs of the 1920s, Margaret in the drawing rooms of her prime, Harry writing about grief in his 30s. What connects them lies not in illness, but in the pressures of royal life, which combines constant public exposure with an almost total absence of ordinary purpose. Wealth removed every practical obstacle to consumption, and deference removed most of the social ones. The people best placed to intervene held the strongest reasons for keeping quiet. 4 centuries separate Mayenne's report from Spare, and the legal status of nearly every substance in this account has shifted at least once along the way. Sweet wine became unremarkable, laudanum became controlled, coca wine became a felony, and the psychedelics that would have looked merely exotic in 1900 now sit inside clinical trials at British universities. The human material underneath moved hardly at all. A queen lent her face to a cocaine tonic and helped sell it to the public. Within a few generations, her descendants' written admission of taking the same drug ran as news around the world. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching this video on the royals who drank and drugged their way through 4 centuries of British history. I hope you found it interesting. Let me know what you thought of their lives down below in the comments. And if you have any suggestions, also let me know down below in the comments. I hope you guys are subscribed and have notifications turned on to get all my videos as soon as I upload them. Anyway, that's all from me. So I'll see all of you in the next video. Thanks.